Oh, here we are again, ladies and gentlemen, with another subhuman piece of shit that decides it's a good idea to go and attack people that are not Muslim. Obviously attacking Jews as the prime target, because the Jews are the prime target until they're gone, and then of course they're gonna come after everyone else. So this fine specimen of a piece of shit that renamed himself to Jihad, as if not to give away his true intentions, had spent about 6 years in Britain as a Syrian refugee. And the thanks that he gives to Western civilization for giving him a chance at a civilized life away from barbarity is that he wants to kill all of us, because God has commanded him to do so. So he went and made himself a fake suicide vest. Thankfully it was fake, because he's probably too uneducated and too fucking stupid to make something real. So he put this fake suicide vest on, and then he went and took his car and rammed it into some elderly people trying to enter a synagogue. He then got out of his car and continued to stab the closest person he could find, killing him. And then he went up to the synagogue trying to get in, threatening the people inside that he's getting in there and he's going to kill them all. Thankfully, there were some armed guards, because armed guards with military uniforms and dress and equipment are a requirement around Jewish facilities, synagogues, community centers, and so forth in the Western world. Now, because of appeasement by so-called leftists that don't understand what Islam is and think that they are having a kumbaya moment by being multicultural with absolute barbarians and satanic death worshippers from hell. So now we have two very well-respected, productive citizens of Western civilization dead, and one person who had already been arrested on suspicion of rape, but of course because he was Muslim he was not charged and he was just let go, because that's of course what happens in BRITANISTAN, where the Labour Party is full of fucking spineless coward pieces of shit like Keir Starmer, and he has people on the cabinet that are actually Islamonazis themselves. We also have a report now that the police actually shot one of the victims that was trying to hold the door closed so that this piece of shit couldn't get inside and kill children. And of course, the Labour Party comes out and puts out a typical copy-paste statement, which is actually completely meaningless and hollow, because they are the party that has turned Britain into Britanistan and done all of this. The blood is on their hands. And who, of course, is the person that is responsible for having the government's role in interacting with the people of Britain, especially minority groups and so forth? It is Shabana Mahmood, who is a known terrorist supporter, and of course she is an Islamonazi herself, so that comes as no surprise. Her legal history includes the legal defense of other Muslims that have been marauding around Britain, attacking people and chanting death to Jews and death to Christians. She was one of the people that helped drop all charges against the convoy in 2022 of the Islamonazi terrorists that got in their cars, draped flags around them, took megaphones, drove around neighborhoods where they could find any kinds of Jewish presence, and they started shouting on the megaphones, "Kill the Jews, rape the Jewish daughters," which is of course what their sex-deprived satanic cult is all about. Here's another fine specimen of this pile of shit. He is apparently a worker for the Turkish consulate or something like that in London. He saw that there was a protester outside the Turkish consulate burning a Quran and protesting against Islamonazism, because of course that's what we Westerners should all be doing. He then went to the man, told him he was going to kill him. He proceeded to go into the Turkish consulate building and get a very big kitchen knife, come outside and begin attacking the man, slashing at him with the knife. He kicked him down to the ground, he spat on him, and he slashed him many, many times. The man was fortunate at falling to the floor and getting away from his stabbing attempts, otherwise the man would probably be dead today. But after this attempted murder, what did this fine specimen of islamonazi heritage bring to the court system in the UK at his hearing? He brought a lot of his fellow islamonazis who told the court what a fine gentleman and a pillar of his community that he was. And so, of course, the Sharia-controlled courts in the UK released him of all charges and let him free right there on the spot after he attempted to murder somebody. Now, what happened to the victim that he attempted to murder? Well, the victim was charged in the same court that let this animal go. He was charged and fined, and he is now on the run and in hiding because the rest of the Islamonazi mob are chasing after him and trying to hunt him down and kill him. Should that Islamonazi mob be successful in hunting the victim down and finishing the job that this piece of shit started, they of course would just be released because it is now becoming law in the UK that offense to their sacred pedophile warlord genocidal piece of shit prophet is a crime, and defending Islam, which is called jihad, is defensible because they are making that into British law. So for any of you who still think that it is wise to vote for the Labour in the UK or the Democrats in the United States, think again. This is what you really are.
The deluded Labour supporter is a unique mammal that has the ability to ignore what's going on whilst living in a fantasy land. This means ignoring any type of facts which could disrupt his reality. But he has a defense mechanism. He's often much more comfortable at home on his phone, calling anyone that doesn't agree with him a far-right extremist or Nazi, followed by a "be kind" meme.
Now, one way that I think it could be useful, because my goal with this channel is really to target Americans and help the people who are leftist ideologically understand that our representation in politics is not left. Asmongold is an interesting streamer. I see him as a very mainstream, everyday American dude that plays games and doesn't really have much knowledge of the world, but he tries to digest news and take rational and logical takes on it, which I think is a good thing, and I think most Americans would be better off if they did the same. Now, not to discredit Asmon at all, because I think he's a fine bloke, but the fact of the matter is that only roughly 7 to 8% of Americans even have passports. And so I, as an American, am actually quite abnormal for being an American, because not only do I have multiple passports, but I've lived in 16 countries, traveled to more than 80 countries. I have spoken 7 languages at different points in my life. This makes me pretty abnormal. Most Americans that I talk to, and they get to this topic of why are you living in Europe right now, or why are you living in Asia right now, wherever I might be, they always come to the conclusion that I must be military, because the majority of Americans that have lived in any other country, it's because they're in the military. I've lived in other countries simply because I am a world citizen and I'm a human being on planet Earth, and I was born a multi-citizen, so it just became natural for me. But one thing that's always frustrated me when I come back home to America, which is where I was born, is that Americans are very ignorant about the rest of the world, and that's nothing to hold against Americans, of course. It's just that America plays a very big role in the world, and the more I've lived around the world, the more I've learned that it is actually a good thing that America is powerful the way it is, because the alternatives are much worse. When I was younger, I used to not really like American imperialism, especially because of our effects and actions in Latin America, where I've lived a good portion of my life, and I have a lot of people who I would consider mi familia. But the fact is that the more I've lived around the world and I've seen the powers at play, and I've seen the way humanity is in this planet of ours, the more I have appreciated that the United States is a strong force, and that we use that force, because in the majority of the planet that we live on, peace can only be obtained by force. Especially in the Middle East, that is really the only language that they understand. Peace through strength is definitely something that is sad reality of the human status quo right now, but it is unfortunately the reality. And it always has been. That's not something that's changed over the years, that's just something that always has been that way. As the Romans used to say, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. That is actually something that holds true today, and the only way that we do have peace is that we are prepared for war. And that is to say, we are prepared to defend peace. Because there are a lot of people out there, a lot of nations, a lot of societies who don't desire peace whatsoever. The primary of those, of course, being Islam, which is a totalitarian, supremacist, racist, genocidal ideology justified by a religious faith, where they believe that their God has commanded them to conquer. But without further ado, let's do a little bit of a take on Asmongold's take here, because I think Asmongold represents a pretty mainstream American, at least pretty good one. And the thing that I want to address here is not his flaw of thinking. I think his thinking is pretty sound. I think his logic is pretty spot on, and his rationale makes sense from an American perspective. Unfortunately, it is not the American perspective that is at play here. It is a completely different world, a completely different worldview, a completely different identity, which is bound to the religious doctrine from God that has commanded them to behave this way. And that is exactly what Americans struggle to understand, because in the Western civilization paradigm, we have something called the separation of church and state. And so separating state from religion is something that is natural for us to understand. We put the two in two different boxes that are completely separate and detached from each other. However, for them, that is not the case, because their religion and all of the beliefs that it brings is their identity, it is their nationality, it is their philosophical belief in all things. There is no difference between their religion and their national loyalty. They view their nationality, no matter what passport they might hold at this current time in history, doesn't matter, because their nationality, their identity is Islam. But without further ado, I wanted to add a little bit of context to his take on this, because I think he is probably digesting this as most Americans probably would. And I simply want to add a little bit more knowledge to his takes, because as a typical American, he is ignorant of most of the world and how it works and how people think. And so his rationale, although it makes sense from an American perspective, the conclusions that he makes are completely wrong and flawed. Not because he's a bad guy, not because he's thinking wrong or anything like that, simply because he cannot understand the way the world works, because he has never been exposed to it. So anyway, let's give this a quick watch and I'll give some feedback.
Ridiculous, honestly. I don't know what goes through people's minds when they target innocent people. It's just...
They're insane. Like, I'm sorry, but like if you're wearing a suicide vest and you crash your car into a religious place and you go in there to stab and kill people with a knife, you are insane. Yeah, you're insane. Like, that's it. Like, they're nuts. And I think that what happens is that a lot of, I think, religious extremism, and this is extremism in general, counts on having those insane people in their ranks in order to execute different things like this.
So here's the first problem. For him, it is too hard to understand how somebody could rationalize in their mind doing an act like this, and so he chalks it off as mental illness, insanity. Unfortunately, that's not really what it is. Yes, you could say that Islam is a mental illness, but then you'd have to say that Islam is a mental illness, but he's not someone that's capable of saying that because he doesn't understand this. And you know, I really don't want Americans to understand this, because in order to understand this, you have to have been affected by it severely enough that you are forced to understand it. And that's not something that I want for any American. Unfortunately, I am someone that has lived through it. I have survived terrorist attacks and attempted murders, so that's something that I know very well, and it forced me to learn about what this is so that I'm not naive enough to put myself in the same situations again. But what I've been through is not something that I wish any American would have to go through. It's not something that I wish any British people would have to go through, but they are going through it right now, and they are learning the hard lesson of what Islam really is. And that is why in the UK there is probably no political solution for what is happening right now, because it has gone too far to the point where really the only solution is civil war. And that's not just me saying that, living here in Europe and being somewhat of an expert on European politics and socioeconomics, because that's part of my background, but it is the opinion of some of the most expert people in the atmosphere and in the community here regarding military and politics and society here in Europe, and especially in Britain, including some of the highest ranking and most awarded military officers from various parts of the British military, active and retired, who have come out and said the same thing, that Britain basically is headed for a civil war because even they don't see a political solution being possible at this point. And let's be very clear what a civil war would look like in Britain. It would be very clear and simple. It would be the islamonazis, with all of their left appeasers, perhaps, against everybody else. Everybody else includes all of the Indian Hindus that have lived in Britain for generations and are an integral, vital part of British culture and national identity. It would include the Druze that have moved there. It would include the And what does everyone else mean? Let's be clear about that as well. It would include the Indian Hindus that have been part of British culture and society, a very integral and vital part of it for many generations. It would include Buddhists from Asia that fled there as refugees 50 and 100 years ago from places like China, Nepal, and many other places. It would include people from African ex-colonies and India ex-colonies and all the ex-colonies that the British Empire had. Those people that have integrated as British people over the last many generations and are just as British as anyone else. It would include a lot of the Christian refugees that fled Islam and came to the West and ended up in Britain hoping that they could have a life away from this monster of a demon, satanic worshipping ideology. It would include the Persians who fled the Islamic takeover of Iran after the completely secular revolution of the students. All of these people had something in common when they came to the West. They were fleeing Islam from all corners of the world, and they came to the West thinking that they would be safe from Islam. They washed their hands of Islam and they said, okay, let your countries continue to be barbaric and live in that way. I wish you well, no matter how disgusting you all are. We're going to the West and we just want to have a good life. But then Islam came to them, because that's what Islam does. It will never stop until it has conquered the entire world. So Asmongold sitting here saying that these are people who are simply mentally ill is another frustration I have with typical Americans, and I'm not upset at typical Americans or Asmongold because I understand why he's ignorant about this, and I honestly don't want him to have to experience what he's gonna have to experience in order to really understand what's going on here. But let's continue watching and I'll give a little bit more feedback.
It doesn't sit right with me.
I've never been frightened. I've been in shelters, sirens, army bases, bombed at in First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, served in the army there.
Wow.
I've never been scared.
There you go. Any of you heard that?
And today I'm scared.
This woman was in the army and she wasn't scared then. That's awful. Holy fuck.
You see, when you are in the military, you know exactly who your enemies are. I mean, in the best case scenario, you do. You at least know what side the enemy is coming from. Maybe they're dressed as civilians, which is very popular with the islamonazis. They pretend to be civilians and then they do suicide bombings and all this kind of garbage. They send their children who are 8 years old up to the guard point to do a suicide bombing. This is normal for them, because sacrificing your children is commanded by God and they view it as something that is good. If they are able to sacrifice their children to kill some soldiers who they view as infidels, that's a positive thing in their book.
Jesus. What the hell is going on?
Exactly, Asmongold. I mean, I know you're sitting there trying to understand this, but you're not going to, dude.
Noise you hear as she's talking, to people already on edge, they speculated was the sound of a controlled explosion. Barely 100 meters from the scene, police sealed off another street. One neighbor here reported seeing people being detained. Police have confirmed 2 arrests.
This attack has been officially declared as a terrorist incident.
I do really think this is substantial, that they have already decided and figured out like what the intent was. Usually it takes them like a day or like at least probably like 12 hours to even come out with anything like that. How do you explain so many of these crazy people coming out of Islam?
Well, maybe he just missed a little bit of information there. No negative on him, of course, but the person was literally shouting Allahu Akbar and I'm gonna kill Jews. So I think it was pretty obvious.
How do you explain so many of these crazy people coming out of Islam? I think there's a lot of ways to explain it. I mean, you have like, obviously like one way, and I mean, if you're trying to get me to condemn Islam categorically, I'm not going to do that. I think that extremist Islam is bad for sure. I mean, absolutely it's bad.
And see, that's what we've been fed in the media, that there's different versions of Islam. For example, moderate Islam and extremist Islam, but in the Muslim world, none of these definitions exist. These definitions have been concocted and invented in order to persuade the West that they can continue killing us and committing terrorist attacks on us and destroying our societies from within, while they're not actually the enemy and it doesn't actually represent Islam. Well, that brings us to what Islam really is and how it functions inside. There is a concept in Islam that is written about extensively in the Quran called taqiyya. It is the practice that Muslims learn from a very early age on how to lie and how to deceive. Specifically, how to lie and deceive the enemy. The enemy in Islam is of course defined as everyone that's not Muslim, that has not yet been conquered by Islam. Which goes back to the 2 fundamental pillars of Islam. There is Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Islam is the world that has already been conquered by Islam. Dar al-Harb, the house of war, is the rest of the world, which is the places in the world that must be conquered by Islam. That is the entire point of Islam. Protecting Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, the portion of the world that has been conquered by Islam and put under Sharia law, and everybody else has been cleansed from that place. And Dar al-Harb, the house of war, which is every other square inch of the planet that Islam is supposed to and must conquer. So taqiyya is this method of lying and deceiving to the infidels, to all the non-Muslims, in order to further that jihad of conquering the rest of the world. It falls under the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. And here we can watch a quick video of a Muslim imam talking to his own congregation on how they can perform that taqiyya even better and keep manipulating and twisting, keep lying, and when they figure out one lie, just make another lie.
We Muslims don't have the bravery that the Sahaba did in conveying the truth. So we lie and we cheat and we claim things that are not part of Islam, and guess what? Not all of them are dumb. They can tell when we lie. They can tell when someone sits behind it that says, Islam is peace. Islam is about peace. There's no jihad. The only jihad is the jihad of the soul. You fight against your struggle, your shaitan, khalas. That's where jihad ends. Every ayah you read in the book of Allah, you have misunderstood it. Ya Shaykh, why are you afraid to tell the people the truth? Don't you think Allah gave him a brain? Don't you think this kafir is going to open the Quran, read Surah Al-Anfal, and he's going to come across these ayat, the military ayat, which you've been trying to hide? Then what are you going to do? Then he's going to say, you guys were lying to me the whole time, and you keep telling me something, and here's your book, here's your Quran. Oh no, but no. See, you don't understand. This ayah was actually abrogated by the other ayah, لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينُ. So now they twist things around. That was in the beginning. I mean, ajib, ya akhi. So you keep playing with the deen of Allah and changing and altering and sugarcoating to please a bunch of people, and at the end of the day, the da'wah is lost in the process.
So we have it from the horse's mouth right there, and this is effectively what they're doing. This is part of their normal discourse. As soon as there is any challenge to their Islamic doctrine, they immediately fall into taqiyya, lying, manipulating, deceiving. If you figure out one lie, you challenge them on that, then they jump to the next immediately without answering. Taqiyya is the Islamic doctrine of deception, lying in Islam that is permitted under certain circumstances, gaining the trust of infidels in order to draw out their vulnerability and defeat them. Kitman is deceit by omission, such as selectively quoting from the Quran in order to conceal a Muslim's malevolent intentions from infidels. Anyway, let's continue.
I wouldn't want to live in a country with Sharia law either, but
Well, if you say that it's not a condemnation of Islam as a whole and you wouldn't want to live in a country with Sharia law, why is that? You see, this is the cognitive dissonance that most Americans are suffering, because we come from a society that wants everybody to be treated equally. We don't want to persecute anybody based on their belief, because in our house, in our society, in our civilization, there's a separation of church and state, and we respect everybody's right to practice whatever religion they want. As long as they keep it at home and they're not trying to shove it down someone else's throat, then it's fine with us. We don't care. But that's the thing. Islam is not a religion. Islam is a totalitarian, genocidal, racist, supremacist ideology. It is a political ideology that is justified by religion. It is justified as an ideology because they believe that God commanded them to spread this supremacist, genocidal, totalitarian, racist ideology across the globe in order to bring the world to an end, and then bring Judgment Day, where all the Muslims, the believers, will go to heaven, and all the infidels, the unbelievers, will go and burn in eternal hellfire. So for a Muslim, this is a struggle that they truly believe that God has commanded them, that they must destroy all non-Muslims, they must conquer the world. And they don't care how long it takes. They don't care if it takes 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, as long as they have done their duty and followed God's commandment to spread Islam. They believe that their entire being on this earth is for that reason alone. They believe that they exist as a human being simply to conquer the world for Islam. And this has been absolutely the same for 1,400 years. It has not changed. It will never change, because the book is specifically written that you cannot change or interpret anything in the book. Trying to change a single word in the book or interpret it differently is punishable by death, and it says so in the book. It specifically says in the book, do not try to alter a single word of this book. Do not try to interpret any of these meanings differently than the way they are explicitly written. And trying to do so is apostasy and heresy, and punishable by death in Islam. So the book itself protects itself. It's a very clever way to write an argument. You basically say that this argument is coming from God and you have to follow it, and you can't interpret it or change a single word of it, otherwise you must be killed. I mean, we have to give credit to this madman Prophet Muhammad that they love so much, because he was actually a pretty smart guy when it came to writing an evil ideology that would attempt to conquer and destroy the entire world and all life on planet Earth. Of course, we then have to think, what kind of force would actually want to destroy all life on planet Earth? Satan. But that's, of course, if you believe in any kind of faith or religion. Personally, I don't, but I don't really care if you do. I respect anyone that believes in whatever faith they want, as long as it's not trying to destroy the world or kill other people.
But that doesn't mean that I'm going to condemn all of them as being wrong. But I think also you have, like, I'm just going to give you one example, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing, you can't condemn. And I agree that it's good that you don't condemn all Muslims, because you don't know what Islam is. So I applaud you for not condemning Muslims, because you're ignorant of what Islam is. condemning Muslims and not understanding what they believe and what their belief system is, not knowing it from the inside out like I do, is the correct way to go. Unfortunately, it's sort of at a state now where the entire world is being attacked by Islam and it is burning because of Islam. There's 50 wars raging around the world, all because of Islam. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that we're in this situation, but we're not on the front line just yet, in America anyway. So I guess until we are on the front line of this war that Islam has declared on the rest of humanity, like Israel is, I guess we sort of have the luxury of being ignorant about it. But at the same time, that's exactly what makes me sad and frustrated. It's a paradox, isn't it?
Right? There's way more Muslims. So the probability of somebody who's a Muslim doing something bad is higher by default because there's more of them.
You see, he really, really wants to be logical and rational in his conclusions here, and I don't blame him at all. I would love to believe this as well. I really would. I would love to believe and rationalize about it like this. But the fact of the matter is that Muslims are the ones doing all the terrorism. All the wars and genocides going on in the world right now are being done by Muslims. As we can see here, according to one French think tank, between 1979 and May 2021, at least 48,000 Islamist terrorist attacks have taken place worldwide, causing the deaths of at least 210,000 people. I mean, we can just look at this list and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. It's never ending, and it's never going to end either. In fact, it's actually ramping up now. It's getting more and more, especially here in the West. And if you're an American, I've seen some YouTube content where some young Americans don't even know who attacked us on 9/11 anymore. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Thousands of Americans were killed, innocent people just working at their job.
So even if it's at the same ratio, you're going to have more people doing this. There aren't that many Jews out there, and there are way more Muslims.
So one thing that you can notice in his comments here on the Twitch stream is that people were saying, well, the Christians did the Crusades. Well, you see, the Crusades happened because Islam had already conquered 2/3 of Europe. Yeah, that's right. 2/3 of Europe had already been conquered and was under siege by Islamic armies. And they weren't sparing anybody the sword in the areas that they had conquered. That's what drove Europe into the Dark Ages, Islamic conquest. You see, Islamic conquest has conquered more territory than any other conquest in human history. Not even the Roman Empire could have dreamed of a conquest the size of the Islamic conquest. In 700 CE, Arabs came out of the Arabian Peninsula and they rushed across Africa. They went east into Asia. They collapsed the Byzantine Empire and they killed the entire Coptic Egyptian Empire. They went into Persia and destroyed that empire. They annihilated all the Buddhists from the mountain ranges in the steppes in the east in Afghanistan. Islamic armies went all the way west to Morocco and then north through Spain and up into France. That's why the Crusades happened, because if the Crusades hadn't happened, then all of the world at this point would probably be under Islam. The Crusades is what saved the world from Islam. It told the Muslim caliphs that they were going to be resisted, and it pushed them back enough to allow Europe to rebuild itself and become a more dominant power. And of course, as we know, if Europe hadn't been a dominant power, then the United States wouldn't exist the way it exists today either. So we can only imagine if the Crusades hadn't happened. I think we need to be very thankful that the Crusades happened, because otherwise the world would probably already be destroyed at this point. I don't think that the world would have lasted to the year 2025 if the Crusades had not happened, because most likely the Muslims would have attained their goal of world domination and then all of humanity would have been destroyed.
Should we remigrate them? I don't think that I don't want to see Britain send every Muslim back to their country. I think that's a little bit overkill.
Yeah, but no. And again, here we see just the lack of knowledge. You know, it's a hard pill to swallow for us civilized Westerners that we would take one population group and say, yeah, you can't be here. We've made a lot of mistakes with that in the past in Western civilization, haven't we? But in this case, it's not the same, because that population group has already conquered 55 nations. They have 55 countries that they can live in. That's more countries than all of Europe has. So if they already have 55 countries, I think we can safely say that they have plenty of places to go without having to live in Western civilized countries in Europe, the United States, the Americas. They have plenty of places that they can go. You see, there's an interesting history here where the US actually declared with the McLaren Act that it was basically at war with Islam already in the 1800s. This was actually the cornerstone that created the US Navy. Yeah, you know why the US is a naval power? Because of Islam. The US didn't really have much of a navy when they were going through the Independence War and even up through the Civil War, but the thing is that the reason the US developed a navy, an actual military navy, was because all they had previous to that was basically a maritime navy, merchant ships. They had a lot of merchant ships. And those merchant ships trying to do trade with Europe and Africa and Mediterranean ended up getting captured by a lot of these Islamic pirates who were small caliph states that had declared loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, one of the biggest empires at the time, basically gave free license to all of its smaller Islamic satellite states to commit piracy and capture any infidel ships that they wanted to. And they had the full support of the Ottomans to do so. And so there actually developed a slave trade whereby the Islamic pirates would go and capture merchant vessels from the US, from England, from all of Europe, and they would take the hostages as slaves, because of course, didn't you know, slavery is part of Islamic law. There's still slavery in the Muslim countries. So slavery being something that was and still is completely normal and under Islamic law, they would take captives. Yeah, that's right, your good old American Yankee slaves on the slave market in Tunisia and Algiers. And that is one of the primary reasons that the United States developed a navy.
But I think they should remigrate every single migrant. Every single person who showed up there and is seeking asylum, I would send every single one of them back with...
Oh, that's a pretty good take, and I think that's a good step that could be taken. You see, a lot of these so-called asylum seekers are only coming here because they want to perpetuate jihad in Europe. And the fact is that most of those people, the majority of those people, they live off of welfare, and then they take their vacations back to the country that they declared asylum from. Yeah, that's right. Under international law, it is actually required that if an asylum seeker ever goes back to the country that they filed asylum from, in other words, if I am from Iraq and I'm declaring asylum in England because I'm afraid of living in Iraq as a threat to my life, then I'm not allowed to go back to Iraq. And the moment that I voluntarily go back to Iraq, I lose my status as a refugee. That's international law. But right now in Europe, the majority of these people are taking their vacations back in the country that they declared asylum from. Yeah, that's right. Let's get the family and take a nice vacation back to Syria, even though we live in Sweden and we just declared asylum from Syria to go live in Sweden, get welfare, have 10 babies with 3 different women so that we could get welfare for each child that we have, and then we basically don't have to work and we can go back and stay in Syria for most of the year and have a free apartment in Sweden. Yep, that's what's happening right now. I've got neighbors that are doing this right now.
With no exceptions. Maybe there's a handful of them that are receiving life-saving health care that, like, you know, I think it would just be a wrong thing to just send them out where they would die. But in a general sense, yeah, I would send them all back. I would send 99% of them back. I would easily say that. If you're illegal deported, yeah, that's what I would do. And I think that if you did that, it would basically solve this problem. You'd still have it a little bit, sure, but like...
It would solve this problem. Maybe you'd still have it a little bit. And what is the problem he's talking about? He's talking about Muslims committing terrorism against us. How can it be that we can sit here and accept any terrorism, any murder of us and our children on our own streets? The cognitive dissonance and the disillusionment that someone has to go through, that they think, oh, well, it's normal. Yeah, we're going to have a little bit of this. Foreign people with a foreign ideology on our soil killing us. And that is something that we can just say, oh, well, we'll have a little bit of it, okay. And that's where I think Asmongold is showing how crazy and insane our Western civilization has become. We are so entrenched and so interested in being tolerant, which is a good thing. It really is a good thing. It's a pillar of our society. It's a pillar of our civilization. But tolerance must have its limits, or tolerance will be eradicated. The famous quote from the famous sociologist Karl Popper comes to my mind all the time when I think about this. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. We must therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate intolerance. And if anything, we could define Islam as pure intolerance. Karl Popper left us that if we want a tolerant society, we must be intolerant of intolerance. And this is exactly what we are seeing today. We need to heed this lesson, and we need to be intolerant of intolerance, or tolerance and those who champion it, us Western civilized people, will perish. And so will the concept of tolerance itself, if we tolerate the intolerant.
The severity of it would tremendously diminish. That's where I'm at.
And again, the thing is that most of these terrorist attackers are not the migrants. They are second and third generation Muslims. Most of the terrorist attacks like this are second and third generation Muslims. Most of the people out vandalizing the streets and attacking people and knifing people, the gangs here in Sweden, for example, it's second and third generation Muslims. It's not migrants. So again, you know, I don't want to be bagging on Asman. I don't expect him to understand this. How could he? I don't expect most Americans to understand that. How could most of you? But this is what is going on, actually. And the fact that most Americans don't understand this means that they aren't going to vote in their own best interest, because they are ignorant of what their own best interest is. And your own best interest as an American is to ensure that Islam stays as far away from our country as possible, because it will never be an ally, it will never be a friendly ideology. It is written, it is concrete, and that is what it is. We could sit here and try to rationalize that, oh well, we should just accept a bunch of Nazis, let them come in here and practice their Nazism. No. Islam is far worse than Nazism.
Why don't we see the same levels in Christianity? I think there's a lot of reasons. Number one, I think Christianity's gone through a lot of different reformations over the years, and I think it's been more modernized. And I think also another reason is because you're inside of a Christian culture and a Christian nation.
So he does get one point here. Christianity did go through reforms, but Christianity was never based on conquering by the sword the entire world. It did a lot of bad things for sure. There was the Inquisitions and all this kind of stuff. Christianity has its dark history, but it did go through some reformation. And then our civilization, which is based on Judeo-Christian values and morals and philosophy, did come up with the concept of the separation of church and state. We invented that. We, the Judeo-Christian civilized West, invented that entire concept of separating the church and the state. This concept does not exist in the Islamic world. Like I said before, the identity of a Muslim is Islam. The nationality of a Muslim is Islam. The political affiliation of a Muslim is Islam. They're not right and left. They are Islam. It's everything, all encompassing. So this is where most Americans, again, fall flat because of ignorance of the world and how different people view the world differently and have a different worldview. And some of those worldviews are evil as fuck, and we should never accept or tolerate them because we cannot tolerate intolerance.
You're probably, like, in the same way that you're not seeing a lot of these terrorist attacks that are happening in Saudi Arabia, as far as I know, right? And so because you're having people that are alienated in another culture, I think that creates a compounding effect that makes people even more radicalized.
Now he's saying that because they're a minority, they become more radicalized, which again, it's hard to blame him for trying to come up with some rationale because he does not understand what Islam is. It's hard to blame him for that, but that is a really big mental jump there. He's effectively saying that all minorities are further to be radicalized. They have a higher likelihood of being radicalized and doing acts like this because they're a minority. That is absolute horseshit. Why is it only Islam then? And guess what? Islam is not a minority. Islam is 25% of all humans on earth. That is not a minority. It is a majority. So if you really want to hear from somebody who grew up and lived this from birth, the most extreme, pure Islamic life, Mossab Hassan Youssef, he is the son of one of the founders of Hamas. Now, groups like Hamas and Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, people say that they are extremist Islam. No, they are pure Islam. They follow the book. By the book. They do exactly what the book tells them to do. And they are revered across the Muslim world. All the other Muslims that are the so-called moderate Muslims, they all feel reverence to these groups. They all feel ashamed of themselves that they aren't as pure Muslim and pure Islamic as these groups are. And again, these groups are Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Those are the pure Muslims that are the role models for all of these so-called moderate Muslims. So yeah, it's not because Islam is a minority in a Christian culture or something like that that makes them radicalized. If that were the case, then we would have Buddhists that were terrorists, we'd have Hindus that were terrorists, we'd have Jewish terrorists, we would have Christian and Druze and Baha'i terrorists, we'd have all the small minorities, the Coptics and the Assyrians and the Orthodox. We'd have terrorists out of all of these different minorities. But we don't. We don't have any terrorists from any of the groups that I just named. We have ideological and political terrorists, yes, but they're not associated with any ethnicity, any ethnic religious culture. They're not associated with, let's say, Native American terrorists. the Navajo tribe terrorists or the Iroquois terrorists. No, we don't have that. Why? Because their ideologies, their philosophies of life, their culture, their society is not conquer through jihad, conquer through violence. But that is exactly what the Quran says, and that is exactly what Islam says. And here's a gentleman that can say it much better than I can.
And then you have something that is not tribal per se, you have Islam. Islam is universal in its claims. It is 2.5 billion or 2 billion people out of the 8 billion or so on the planet. And there has been a debate in America going back to 9/11 about whether Islamic radicalism of the kind that we've seen in Al-Qaeda, we've seen with ISIS, we've seen it with Islamic Jihad, is all of that a natural product of Islam, or is it a deviant spin-off of Islam that is out of the true spirit of Islam?
To answer his question, yes, it is a product of Islam. But again, Westerners, Americans specifically, they haven't lived through it. They can't stomach the truth. And it's hard, believe me, it's hard to stomach the truth. But when you have to stomach the truth for the sake of your own life and your children's future, you have to decide which is better, which is more important. Stomaching the truth and being a man and standing up for Western civilization against this evil and calling it what it is, or allowing your children's future to be burned up in flames. And that's why I'm here.
What do you say?
Look, this is the dangerous zone that nobody wants to enter. Why? First of all, Muslims are a majority. When we talk about 25% of the population of Earth, this is not just a small minority.
Right.
And they are very powerful because behind them is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Persian Gulf money, the Islamic Republic. They have been buying the West. That includes property. That includes politicians. When a small country like Qatar, but very wealthy, owns 10% of the French bonds or trust, do you want to convince me that they don't have influence when it comes to the French politics? And they pose as a moderate Muslim country, while basically they are sponsoring Hamas, spreading the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and selling the West through their Al Jazeera a peaceful version of Islam that does not exist. Let's say the vast majority of Muslims, they don't agree with the Islamic barbarism. And when I say barbarism, why? Because in Quran, and this is the highest authority in Islam, it's the word of Allah, and it functions as legislation. This is what inspires jihadists. Jihadists did not misinterpret Islam. They understand Islam completely. So the vast majority of Muslims identify with something that they completely oppose because it's basically their birth identity. But it's a religious identity, just like Palestinianism. It's not an ethnicity. It's not a race. And because of this financial influence in the West of Arab oil money, they silenced everybody. Anybody who tried to criticize Islam, they get canceled. For example, it was part of my work after I published my books to go on campuses and speak to the students based on my first-hand experience. And I didn't know why I was canceled from campuses. Today, we realize that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other oil Arab countries and Muslim countries control campuses because they are big donors. And how to bring someone who actually broke free from Islam on campus to criticize Islam? Then they would piss off their donors. And now they compromise the truth. Instead of educational institutions, how many people came out of Islam and lost everything, put their life on the line? Instead of listening, I studied the Sharia, I studied the Quran, I grew up among Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, which are now functioning as a threat to civilization and to the global security. Are you kidding me that I did not qualify at least to have a podium or a platform to express my first-hand experience? What kind of universities would cancel me just because of my speech? And I did not mean to offend the Muslims. They labeled me immediately as Islamophobic, even though I was brought up in Islam. So what's the outcome of this? Radicalization, and this is how they keep spreading their hateful ideologies against the West while they have the cover of being a peaceful religion. I have a duty towards the Muslim people. And yes, I need to wake them up because they are drunk and deeply asleep. They are identifying with something that is not them. But everybody is trying to get along. And this is not the way. In Christianity, everybody is criticizing Christianity. You criticize Judaism, no problem, it's not a crime. But dare to criticize Islam. And as long as we have not overcome this barrier that is basically created by Arab and Islamic influential states that now control compromised politicians in the West, as long as we don't realize this, they will continue to invade the West to the point where they would bleed the West from its values, from its ethics, and leave us like literally a skeleton.
Yeah, so that's the difference between Asmongold, really cool guy, logical, rational, typical American dude trying to make sense of everything, but ignorant about the world, ignorant about what really exists in humanity outside the little bubble that he lives in which is the United States. The United States is a bubble, maybe a big bubble, but it's still a bubble. And the world is not that way. It's very different. And the world is coming to the United States. It's already in there. They've already invaded. Dearborn, Michigan, Minneapolis, New York City is next. Look at London. British people can't live in London. Look at Paris. French people can't live in Paris. This is what's happening, folks. And as a leftist, you should be the front line against this. All leftist values, all the things that leftism and progressivism stands for, is the furthest opposite of this totalitarian barbarity. You cannot call yourself a leftist if you are allied to this in any shape or form. Period. And I think that's the litmus test that we leftists need to hold our representatives to. The single most important litmus test there is. It will be very easy to see what side they really are on. Are they a snake in our bed? Or are they actually a leftist that will represent us? I think that's the easiest way that we can find out. So, another tragedy and another video, and I'll see you in the next one.